Okay, thanks a lot for the invitation. This work was done together with 5 of my co-workers from Rigshospitalet in Copenhagen, and they will be part of the published paper in the end. So I will just, for the matter of time, go straight for the first historic recording of oroalimentary automatism, which you can see on the right. This is the original publication, which is from the 7th century BC. It's in Neo-Assyrian in cuneiform text. It's part of a 30 clay tablet long medical textbook. And on tablet 25 and 26, they described about 30 different seizures with different semiology. They described the cause. They described which demon is responsible for it, whether it's a focal or a generalized demon. And eventually, they described the prognosis. And in 2 of these seizures, they somewhat into the seizure describe a lip puckers, saliva flows from his mouth, and in another, he is much darkened, keeps opening and shutting his mouth. Of course, there's been mentioning later on in the more recent centuries of similar phenomena, but I guess the first one really to nail the phenomena is, of course, Hewling Jackson. Before quoting him, I will just mention the definition from the ILA paper by Beniski and al. It's that oroalimentary automatisms, I will abbreviate OAA here, include chewing, lip smacking, lip pursing, licking, and swallowing, and resemble normal routine behaviors. And of course, the last part is quite important. I must say there's a spelling error here because it should be pursing, not pursuing. I just checked a moment ago with British authorities. So, Jackson gave his famous talk in the Hungarian Society in January 1879, and in this excellent talk I can recommend, he said that certain movements should be distinguished from spasms, either tonic or clonic. A common one is the movement of mastication, another is swallowing movement. Of course, all movements as well as spasms imply nervous discharges, but the former implied slight discharges at particular intervals. I submit that the movements of mastication, swallowing, etc., occurring in the slight fit cannot depend on an excessive discharge, that is, on an epileptic discharge. And I think this is quite shrewd to Jackson to observe this, and it is important for the rest of the talk, as you will learn. So the brief classical view, as asked, is that oroalimentary automatism are generally considered to indicate a temporal lobe seizure, and that will also be the take-home message main. So, what are the controversies? Well, the job here was to correlate the epileptogenic zone with semiology features. And the problem is, if this occurs at onset every time, it is a quite nice connection, and it makes sense to say that it comes from that part of the brain. I fully sympathize with Philip's notes this morning why we have designed the whole endeavor here like it is, but if you look at the Lüder's principles, this is just a random sketch, but if you have the epileptogenic zone here, then of course seizure activity can propagate to another place for the symptomatogenic zone, which is what is probably happening in this case, as I will show you. So just an example of what it looks like. The patient is now 1 minute into a focal seizure with aphasia. She can actually still respond, but is not fully alert. And this is like lip smacking and chewing. This is one variant of these automatisms. She has a temporal lobe seizure. So we aligned us with our local librarian to make the best search. Annette Sideros and her sat together and refined this. So in the search string we had 3 different spellings of oroalimentary, then lip smacking, chewing, swallowing, and epilepsy, epilepsies, epileptic, or seizures. And this search was run both in the PubMed and in the Embase, generating this number of hits, and there was a 359 duplicate between those. And mind you, not more than that, which also tells something about the sensitivity of these searched. Then finally, after reading the papers and the references, we found another 37 other papers we had to read. So finally, we screened altogether 1,640 papers. So for the final calculations, as we use them in these tables, we had to put up quite strict criteria to make these tables make sense. So, of course, we included papers concerning the anatomo-clinical correlation of oroalimentary automatisms with brain subregions, and we tried also to focus on subregions. We excluded very easily abstract-only, non-English, non-retrievable papers where a number of patients with OAA is not specified separately or cannot be calculated from tables or figures. Then we also excluded paper where all patients have OAA. Why so? Because if this is a selection criteria, then the paper will tell us nothing about how frequently it occurs in general. So we simply did not include those in the tables. Then also stimulation studies where the OAA was not related to the patient's seizures, because it's actually mapping of normal function. Again, it doesn't tell us about the spontaneous seizures in these regions. And then studies where these OAA was at onset only, where the study focused what happens at onset, and not including OAAs in the remaining part of the seizures in these patients, because again, it was severely skewed, even if it was extremely interesting. Finally, we also excluded studies mainly concerning very small children, because it's a different story. I will tell you separately about that. So the Prisma flowchart shows you the original number. We read the 95 papers in full, and according to the criteria, ended up with 22 articles with 704 patients. These are the first 11 of the 22. I actually included also data in the papers where we couldn't separate patients with OAA from the remaining. So the red data are those where we could separate, and the black is so for the whole bunch of patients in this study. As you can see, it is mainly adults in these papers with quite a lot of patients, and they are altogether temporal lobe studies, which is, of course, a severe bias. The first paper by Dupont, he includes 390 patients, and half of these patients had oroalimentary automatism. The study was performed to look for lateralizing features. And the main conclusion here, as for most of the remaining papers, that there's no lateralizing feature with OAA. It's quite uninformative, but of course, if you have along with it a blurred awareness, then it's more likely to be from the left. It could also be right. And as described at paper 7, seizures with full consciousness despite OAA, and these were all from the non-dominant hemisphere. I won't go into details with further papers, just mention that since they were highly selected temporal lobe patients, many of them with pre-selection that they had a fine outcome. Of course, they had a fine outcome. So you see very high numbers here for the operated patients. The next 11 patients, you see now there are smaller numbers, and there are many more children included here. So many of the information about children are actually from quite short series. Otherwise, again, most of them were temporal lobe studies and have nice outcome. Only 3 of these studies are actually concerning frontal lobe seizures, and with very small numbers with this phenomenon, which is a problem. So summarizing here, again, it's for all we have in the last column, the red data are for those studies where we could decipher the OAA patients separately, and this is for the whole group. But all the other numbers here are for the OAA patients. We had 704, most adults, most MR positive, only a little more than a third had stereo EEG, most were operated, and most had excellent outcome. And there was a high or very high confidence in the epileptogenic zone in most patients. Then the anatomy clinical correlation. Here we tried to separate into subregions, because many papers actually looked into subregions of the temporal lobe, hence the many groups. Some papers only look at the unspecified whole temporal lobe. They are not lumped. This is those papers who only looked into the whole temporal lobe. And the figure here is the paper with the lowest or highest representation of oroalimentary automatism in the group of patients in this study. So in the unspecified, you see virtually, roughly about 60 to 80% had these automatisms. And mind you that all of these papers, they were not exclusively, but mainly propagation. Even some papers stated that this is the first objective sign. But then, of course, either they state, oh yes, there was actually an aura for 10 or 15 seconds before, or they didn't mention an aura at all. So onset is not really reliable in this case. So mostly propagation, and the occurrence in the mesial temporal lobe is quite high, up to 81%. if you have studies focusing only on hippocampus, it's actually a bit less. And then in the temporal pole, if the epileptogenic zone is there, you see it in 42% of these cases. In the temporal operculum, it's lower. In the lateral cortex, it's of course a bit higher, but not as high as mesial. It's about 30 to 47%. And in the posterior temporal, which is behind the standard temporal resection, it's even lower, but still it's quite prevailing. Then we looked into the Rolandic operculum, and here it is also not so rare to see it when the seizure onset zone is here. And finally, it's also not very rare in seizures originating in the orbitofrontal cortex. In general, we found that the grade level was moderate in most patients because of the big sample bias and publication bias in these papers. Then, of course, we have the papers which nicely describe the onset, just reminding you of this problem with the symptomogenic versus seizure onset zone and epileptogenic zone. A paper here focused only on onset, and in the temporal pole, you saw OAA in the onset of 12% of the patients. In this paper focusing on the amygdala and only looking into onset, it was found that two papers that between 32 and 50% of seizures originating in the amygdala started with OAA. And this is actually higher than those who try to look into hippocampus, where seizures remain there without a spread, but they didn't fit into the scheme, so I don't show you the data. But it appears that amygdala has a really high importance for the onset of OAA. Then finally, the insula. And it was quite disappointing. We didn't find a single paper fulfilling the criteria fully that we could use here, but there were two extremely nice papers. One by Francine Chassou, where she looked at the PET hypometabolism in patients who have and have not oroalimentary automatisms, seizures originating for the mesial temporal structures. And indeed, 95% of those patients who had it showed a hypometabolism in the insula as opposed to none of the other groups. So it's really points to an important role of the insula. And then a nice steroid study, which I will show you in detail in a moment, showed that you couldn't have OAA without activation of the insula. So here we already start to see the pattern I am hinting at here. And here we have a very high grade level because of very nice implantations in the steroid studies. I will now try briefly to mention the small children results. There's a study by Duchovny in 14 small children below 22 months, and most of them were severely delayed. So it's a very selected group of patients. And here 58% had either lip smacking, mouthing, licking, and chewing. I guess there's some overlap between mouthing and licking. It's not very clear how to delineate mouthing, but it's popular in the neonates at least to describe it. By described 7 children, and these were all selected for having automatisms in the seizures, and in 2 small children below 2 years had it out of 4. And interestingly, one of these were operated for tuberous sclerosis in the left central region. So clearly it can of course also spread from that region. In 4 older patients had it also, and they had all temporal lobe epilepsy. Then there was 11 children left, and only 2 had possibly temporal, 3 unknown, and the remaining were frontal lobe seizures. So that's kind of a negative result, which is also interesting. Then Fugarasi made 2 excellent studies. 15 children operated for temporal lobe epilepsy with excellent outcome, and OAA occurred in 53% of the patients. They had also manual automatisms with the same frequency as OAA. And in the smaller age, motor signs, focal tonic myoclonic spasm predominate. After 4 years, automatisms and other traditional phenomena predominate. And they made this age correlation, where this is the part of the motor rate, which is high in the small children, and in children above 4 years, there's actually many who don't have motor, but only automatism and hypomotor. In extratemporal study of 35 children in frontal lobe epilepsy, 40% had automatism and 53% in the posterior cortex epilepsy, showing that it can definitely be generated from outside, spread from outside the temporal lobe. Munari summarized 30 years of experience from the St. Anne Hospital, together with Banco and Talirac, and they found 59 patients with these automatisms recorded during an acute sterility in the operation theater in the temporal room. And 19 of these 59, there was OAA within 5 seconds of onset, and in all of these cases, amygdala was always involved, hippocampus almost as often, temporal pole less. So Munari indicates the late OAA also indicates disorganization of the amygdala, but offers no conclusion on the origin of the discharge. Again, I think a very sharp observation. Swallowing and salivation was not included here, and he stated that which we believe are related to disorganization of the parainsular and suprasylvian region. I will skip this about mechanisms, just briefly mention that it is believed to be a release phenomenon that actually allows central pattern generators in the brainstem and spinal cord to act here together with subcortical mechanisms in the opercular insula regions and the subcortical nuclei in the brainstem and basal ganglia, which is also going back to Jackson's original observation that is actually a release of regions outside the cortex. Aupri described 15 patients with excellent outcome with sterility, and doing time frequency linear regression coherence analysis, he concluded that OA occurred only after spread to anterior insular and frontal operculum, preceded by theta coherence between vitiotemporal and insular opercular cortex. As you see here, during the seizure course, the moment you get into the 6 Hz activity in all these regions shown here, you have onset of the oroalimentary automatism. I think this is a very crucial paper. Wang et al. Have studied the relandic operculum and found that this was activation here was separated groups with and without oroalimentary automatism, supporting this paper and really focusing on the relandic operculum, the area which is around the central sulcus and shared between frontal and parietal operculum. So the conclusion is that these automatisms occur mainly, if not exclusively, during propagation of seizure activity. Mesial origin is more common than lateral in the temporal lobe, but it might be absent if seizure activity does not propagate outside the hippocampus. Involvement of relandic frontal operculum and possibly anterior insular seems to be important for the occurrence of OAA through synchronized ictal activity with amygdala hippocampus in the theta range. Seizure onset in the orbital frontal cortex and other extratemporal regions may evolve into OAA dependent on the spread of seizure activity. And hereby I conclude. Thank you very much.